I am deeply honored to read for you a new episode of the Harlequin stories written by fiction writer Maxwell Conroe. This episode is called Dr. Freud. As a regular listener, you may notice I am not the usual narrator, but the male voices are a bit easier to be acted out by me. No worries. Our regular female voice artist will be back soon. Several months after Adeline's last appearance, Maxwell was still preoccupied by her dazzling character. No less so had Greek mythology taken a strong grip on his mind. All of this had taken him by complete surprise, and now he had another unexpected visitor. "Don't you see, then," said the visitor, "as a writer, you have been suppressing your creative needs for so long. It all needs to come out right now." This visitor was no insignificant passerby. No, this man claimed to be the reincarnation of Dr. Sigmund Freud, and he appeared to know his classics and Greek mythology very well.
"Maxwell, let's face it. You started very late in life your literary writing projects. But had you not wanted to become a writer already when you were a young lad? In psychoanalysis, we know that the suppression of thoughts and desires in adolescence may lead to unexpected effects on one's emotional state. Your apparitions are just one manifestation of precisely that effect."
I earlier mentioned to you, dear reader and listener, that Maxwell's guest claimed to be the reincarnation of Sigmund Freud. Let me tell you how this aspect of our visitor was revealed. Sir, with all due respect, I value your opinions, but we all know what Sigmund Freud looked like, and you look very different. How can you claim to be Sigmund Freud, or his reincarnation?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you for asking. It's all quite simple. My mind lives on in the hosts I choose to live on in. After my death, I have spent time in the likes of my famous successors like the Canadian psychoanalyst Dr. Eric Byrne, and briefly Oliver Sacks, and even Dr. Phil, the TV guru. But that was a big mistake. No, but as you can see, I now inhabit the body and mind of Alejandro Jodorowsky. I am so pleased to meet you, Mr. Maxwell.
This was quite a series of bold claims. Now I was to believe that the appearance of Alejandro Jodorowsky really was carrying me to the spirit of Sigmund Freud?
I see.
That's all very interesting. But what are you telling me about my obsession with Greek mythology and the ancestry of Adeline?
That's not hard to see. Maxwell, be honest to yourself. Why do you think you are obsessed with this person Adeline and her ancestry?
I had to think hard here. Amazing how psychologists, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts, and psychomagicians all are perfectly capable of seeing through my fake facade, knowing at once what is really at the core of my obsession. I was thinking, did I really know the answers myself? As Dr. Freud was suggesting? Please, Dr. Freud, I began buying time. Can you help me figure this out? I need a few more hints to have my blinkers removed and see clearly what drives my mind to this dreadful obsession.
Let's first talk a bit more about the old Greek plays featuring Elektra, whom you told me is the very same as the Adeline Harlequin character appearing in your recent stories about apparitions. In fact, I myself have studied in considerable detail the behavior and demeanor of Elektra as portrayed in the Greek tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. It appears all of them made Elektra into a central character of their stories. These men, too, were obsessed with her. Why do you think this occurred?
Again, I was groping my mind for clues. I did not have the slightest idea. I was getting rather desperate to structure my thoughts, but could not regain control of the loose fragments in my head. No concrete insights or suggestions that came up had any bearing on Dr. Freud's question. Freud noticed my blank facial expression, and somehow was not even expecting any answer. He just resumed his psychoanalytical exploration of my case.
Then, Maxwell, if you don't know why these men were obsessed with Elektra, do you know perhaps what Elektra, in turn, was obsessed with?
This was a somewhat easier question. Well, I began,
I think she regretted the violent death of her mother, and the fact that she herself was used by the Furies under the spell of Athena as an instrument of death.
Dr. Freud, with the appearance of Alejandro Jodorowsky, I admit it seems a far-fetched construct, but this is how it was in my apparition, stared at me without saying a deep word or a peep. This was clearly a professional pose, prompting me to think harder and come up with more ideas, suggestions, and psychoanalysis of, ultimately, my own case.
Okay, I admit, it's all about sex.
Maxwell had said this half as a joke, because he knew Dr. Freud always invoked sex as a big source of inner turmoil. Maybe that applied to him, Maxwell that is, as well. And believe me or not, Jodorowsky's face lit up and he said, "Now you're getting somewhere. Tell me more."
Well, I have been imagining having sex with Adeline, but I'd like to keep details private if you don't mind.
Again, there was the blank pose and silent urging of me to do better and come up with more explanations and clues as of the source of my obsession.
Yes, it is, as you say. Although Adeline must be centuries old, her physical appearance I find nonetheless very appealing, and her mind in a way exudes many refreshing ideas too.
Maxwell, let me help you out a little bit. It's no shame to have certain sexual thoughts, like the ones you seem to struggle with, maybe even suppress. Let me tell you that the old Greek scribes were also obsessed with Elektra in much the same way.
Freud said the old Greek scribes were obsessed with Elektra because they knew she liked older men. After all, she had been deeply in love with her own father, so while Elektra adored older and ripe men, the older men were lusty after young women, Elektra being the willing object of their lust, at least in their stories. They made her out to be exactly how they liked her to be.
Based on the stories of the Greek scribes, my colleague Dr. Carl Jung went as far as describing a certain type of behavior named the Elektra Complex. According to this psychological theory, many girls go through a phase when their sexuality awakes and blossoms to embark on a psychosexual competition with their mothers for the favors and possession of their father. This is how Elektra was portrayed by the great Greek scribes. She killed Clytemnestra for taking away the only man in life she ever really loved, King Agamemnon of Mycenae.
Freud, still in the body of Jodorowsky, was apparently very pleased with his own explanation of the Elektra Complex. His face looked bright, and he smiled when he had finished his explanation. He scraped his throat as to announce another soliloquy was due, and sure it was. Here is what he said.
Maxwell, I am not sure if you have read all of the 3 tragedies which feature Elektra in a prominent role. The oldest reuse of the old myth about Agamemnon's family tragedy was by Aeschylus. His tragedy, titled Orestea, won a big prize in 458 BC. Nearly 40 years later followed Elektra, a tragedy written by Sophocles in 420 to 418 BC, shortly followed by another tragedy by Euripides, 413 to 410 BC, also titled Elektra. Even Homer had already made mention of the death of Agamemnon in his Odyssey. If you rethink and analyze all these old Greek myths and tragedies, in the light of my psychoanalytical theory, how did each of these authors portray Elektra?
Now the doctor had me thinking again. Well, I thought, let's make the best out of the situation. I'll try to say something intelligent about the subject.
Okay, Dr. Freud, thank you for pointing me in the right direction. If I grope my memory, Aeschylus' tragedy features Orestes as the main killer, but he is very much morally supported by Elektra, who helps him fulfilling the murder of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, the lover of Clytemnestra. But Adeline, Elektra, claims she and her brother were driven to the matricide, not by their own free will, but by Athena's furies, sent after them to avenge the death of Agamemnon.
Very well. And whom do you think is responsible for this portrayal of the events and the deeds of the main characters? Are the scribes portraying true events unfolding in front of them while they witness the actions of their characters?
Well, given the fact that Aeschylus lived several centuries after the time when the Trojan War took place,
He cannot possibly have witnessed any facts. All he used as a base material must have been from oral narrations, as retold generation after generation. One may confidently assume Aeschylus created an image of Elektra the way he wanted her to be seen, or rather, he made her the way he wanted.
And what do you think of Elektra's portrayal by Sophocles? How did he make Elektra appear in his tragedy bearing her name?
In Sophocles' play, Elektra is portrayed as the father mourning daughter who holds her mother responsible for his murder. Initially, Orestes is still undercover, having faked his own death in a chariot racing accident. When he returns to Mycenae to revenge the death of his father Agamemnon, he reveals himself to his mourning sister. In this version of the tragedy, a second sister, Chrysothemis, enters the picture, but she refuses to be part of any killing plot. According to Sophocles, the place of the killing is not the royal palace, but actually Elektra's home. She lured her mother to her home with news of a baby and, with Orestes' help, kills Clytemnestra. Together, they willfully slay their mother, Clytemnestra.
Overall, what do you think of the portrayal of Elektra by Sophocles?
Well, Sophocles portrays her as a cold-blooded murderess. Although there are Furies haunting the siblings, Orestes and Elektra fulfill their evil deeds. In the portrayal by Sophocles, it's the siblings themselves who are fully accountable for this matricide.
Very well. And finally, then, what about Euripides? How did he portray Elektra in his tragedy about her life?
In Euripides' version of the tragedy, Elektra was married off to a peasant, being denied her royal status by her mother Clytemnestra, who wanted sole reign over Mycenae with Aegisthus at her side and without any psychosexual competition from her own daughter. So Elektra was sent to live with a peasant, and much lamented her change in social status, having to do endless household chores like a slave. When Orestes finally returns from abroad and he finds the conditions his sister lives in, they begin to plot together for avenging their father's untimely death. In Euripides' interpretation, Orestes first killed Aegisthus in the royal stables. He and his sister then proceed to confront their mother. When Orestes sees his mother, he wavers, but Elektra convinces Orestes they shall kill Clytemnestra, which is then enacted by thrusting a sword down her throat. In the end, Castor and Pollux berate Orestes and Elektra, telling them how they shall atone and purge their souls from the shameful matricide. And then the Furies tell Elektra she must marry Pleiades, Orestes' friend, while Orestes himself is forced to leave the city.
What do you think of the portrayal of Elektra by Euripides?
Here, Elektra is as cold-blooded in her murder of Clytemnestra as was her mother when she killed Agamemnon. In Euripides' version of the tragedy, Orestes had more qualms and wavered, but then his sister pushed him to jointly enact their plan for matricide. Elektra was the principal driving force behind the killing of Clytemnestra. Euripides portrays her as a revengeful person and a murderess.
In summary, how do you compare the three portrayals of the same historic claim, namely that the Queen of Mycenae was killed by her own children in retribution for her killing of the king?
In brief, Aeschylus in his story puts much emphasis on the divine surveillance of human behavior, and divine intervention is what directed the murders. In fact, all murders were committed out of the Greek gods' whims. So in effect, Orestes and Elektra were both duped by the gods in Aeschylus' tragedy. Euripides in his tragedy has built in the element of sexual humiliation by the banning of Elektra from the royal court. She lived like a peasant woman. That gave Elektra an additional motive to be spiteful to her mother. Although it did not make the killing of her mother by the siblings less horrible, Euripides made it slightly more understandable. But Orestes wavered, and Elektra did not. She is portrayed as the primary killer of her mother.
And?
In Sophocles' tragedy about Elektra, she and her brother act as cold-blooded murderers.
Do you think any of these old Greek playwrights held misogynistic views?
Possibly, and if so, Euripides was the worst misogynist. Sophocles comes in second place. Aeschylus was the least hostile by leveraging the ultimate responsibility for all the evil acts to the whims of the gods.
And Maxwell. Do you realize that the character of Elektra only exists because the writers have chosen to immortalize her in their portrayal of her as a killer in a way they saw fit at the times they lived?
Of course, I agree and see your point.
Now, let's move back, without further ado, to the key issues at hand. Here, I have 3 questions for you. 1. Why was the 3 playwrights so obsessed with Elektra? 2. Why are you, yourself, so obsessed with her reincarnation as Adeline? 3. And finally, Elektra herself and your Adeline. Do you think that these characters themselves had any say over how they were portrayed by their scribes?
Well, fair enough, Doc. I see where you're going. Let me start with answering the last question. I now fully realize that Elektra and Adeline are character portrayals by writers. I myself created Adeline, just as the Greek playwrights created their version of Elektra. As always, the characters created by the writers run a high risk of abuse at the hands of their creators. I have carefully documented such examples before, especially in my Dupin files. See Magic Musings, a 2023 book of mine. But that's another story. So yes, Elektra and Adeline had 0 say over how they were portrayed by the creators of their tragedies.
Very well. I accept your analysis as being truthful and conscientious. Now let's move on to hear your answers to my first 2 questions, please.
According to what you alleged earlier in your explanation of the Elektra Complex, the 3 writers utilized the theme of paternal love to provide Elektra with an incentive to kill her mother. Apparently, the playwrights liked the idea of a young woman falling in love with an older man, even if it is her own father. Elektra was competing with Clytemnestra out of psychosexual fixation with her father. That is what all 3 playwrights allude to, and their stories lend credibility to that myth. One might go one step further and accuse the playwrights of crowd-pleasing by simply appealing to the public with that popular theme in the way they portrayed Elektra. And their tragedies also affirmed the myth that older men are fancied and even adulated by younger women. Seen through modern eyes, their portrayal of the male chauvinist view of women is largely outdated in our modern times.
Outdated, Is it, Maxwell?
You're right. That is debatable, yes.
And now, my dear Maxwell, please answer the second of the 3 questions I asked you to comment on. Why are you so obsessed with the reincarnation of Adeline?
Great question. Here's what I think. Obviously, yes, I am obsessed with Adeline. I think the fact that I made her a burlesque Harlequin in my story displays a perverse streak in my imagination. But do we not all have lurid fantasies from time to time?
By all means. But you wanted to understand what was the whole point of you writing the Harlequin stories, am I right?
Yes, that's true. As an existential writer, or rather writer about existential issues and the meaning of life, I want to discover truth and reason. So when I started creating a Harlequin coming to me in an apparition, I wonder, why does that happen? Why did I create her?
Precisely. You seem to be getting down to the core of the issue.
Well, I created her, Adeline, and invented the whole riddle about her background coming from an old Greek dynasty of kings, and the story plot remains very simple. I tolerated Adeline questioning my habit of perpetual logical reasoning, which behavior she condemns as typical human and narrow-minded. She prefers to create illusions and to entertain. One might accuse me of being a male chauvinist by portraying Adeline, a woman, as either incapable or unwilling of logical thinking, and instead having her serve up illusions for entertainment.
Maxwell, do you realize you may have cast Adeline in your own affirmation of the Elektra Complex, which I and Dr. Jung also have cast her in? I admit, in the end, we men all commit the same sin. We polarize gender roles, and then seek out a safe position for mirroring our gender preferences and how we ourselves want to see or understand gender relationships. It's all very recognizable, even a century after my death.
Very interesting indeed, Doc.
But is it bad, this obsession with Adeline? I hoped it helped you talking to me about it in our psychoanalytical session. I recommend you read also the book Psychomagic by Alejandro Jodorowsky. He wrote some interesting things about how magic and symbolism can help heal psychological traumas. Are you saying that I have suffered a psychological trauma that explains why I am obsessed with Adeline?
Freud was gone. He sure had given me lots of things to think about. And now I have this nagging thought about what trauma I could possibly have suffered from, and how it can explain my obsession with Adeline, which now has spilled over into me trying to unravel and understand the details of her family tragedy. As a writer, I'm determined to get to the bottom of the issue. More is to come.